Where do Bulgarians really come from? It sounds like a simple question, but it is one that has divided historians, archaeologists, and generations of textbooks across Europe. Some argue Bulgarians are mostly Slavs, shaped by early medieval migrations from the north. Others insist their roots run much deeper, back to ancient Balkan populations who lived on this land thousands of years before history had names. And then there is a third idea, just as powerful and just as controversial, that Bulgarians descend from steppe peoples, the Bulgars, arriving from the east and reshaping everything in their path. So which story is true? Each explanation sounds convincing on its own. Each has historical sources behind it, and each has been used to explain identity, culture, and even physical appearance. Light versus dark features, northern versus southern differences, mountain profiles versus plains. People notice these contrasts and assume they must point to a single origin. But here's what most people miss. History is loud. It focuses on invasions, empires, and rulers. DNA is quiet. It records who stayed, who mixed, and who survived. And today, for the first time, modern genetic research is entering this debate as an unexpected referee. Ancient DNA recovered from graves, large-scale studies of living populations, statistical models that don't care about national myths or political narratives. They only track inheritance. Now comes the twist. What scientists are finding is not a clean answer, not Slavic or Thracian or steppe. Instead, the evidence points to something far more complex. A story built in layers. A population shaped by continuity as much as by change. A land where history moved again and again, but people often stayed. DNA tells a quieter story. So if Bulgarians are not the result of one migration, one conquest, or one origin myth, what are they really? Modern DNA is changing the answer. And once you see the full picture, it becomes impossible to look at Balkan history the same way again. That debate begins now. So let's begin with the debate itself. Because the question of Bulgarian origins did not start with DNA. It was inherited. For more than a century, historians have argued over a handful of competing narratives. The first is perhaps the most familiar to international audiences. The idea that Bulgarians are mainly Slavs. According to this view, large Slavic migrations entered the Balkans during the early Middle Ages, settling the land, reshaping culture, and forming the core of the population we see today. Language is often used as the strongest evidence here. Bulgarians speak a Slavic language. Therefore, many assume the people themselves must be overwhelmingly Slavic in origin. But this explanation, while neat, leaves uncomfortable gaps. Another long-standing perspective pushes in the opposite direction. It argues that Bulgarians descend primarily from much older Balkan populations, groups who lived in this region long before medieval migrations. People sometimes summarize this as a Thracian or ancient Balkan origin. Supporters of this idea point to archaeology, continuity of settlement, and ancient descriptions of the region as densely populated long before Slavs ever appeared in historical records. Then there is a third narrative, equally influential, the story of the Bulgars. According to this view, the formation of Bulgaria begins with steppe peoples arriving from the east. Nomadic warriors who established political control, gave the country its name, and reshaped identity from the top down. Over time, this narrative has been exaggerated in different directions. Some imagine the Bulgars as a dominant genetic force. Others see them as nearly irrelevant biologically but decisive politically. And finally, there is a fourth layer that often enters the conversation: the Ottoman period. In popular imagination, centuries of Ottoman rule are sometimes described as a time of massive demographic change, a period when population replacement supposedly altered the genetic makeup of the region entirely. This idea appears frequently in simplified explanations, especially outside academic circles. Here's the problem. Each of these narratives isolates one chapter of history and treats it as decisive. Mostly Slavic, mostly ancient Balkan, mostly steppe, mostly Ottoman. Real history is rarely so clean. But here's what most people miss. These debates were formed before genetics existed as a tool. They relied heavily on language, written sources, political history, and assumptions about how populations behave during conquest. And those assumptions often lean toward replacement. The idea that new groups arrive, old ones disappear, and identity resets. DNA research challenges that model, not by erasing history, but by adding scale, time depth, and biological continuity. Now comes the twist. When modern geneticists look at Bulgaria, they don't start by asking who conquered whom. They ask something much quieter. Did people actually leave? Were they replaced? Or did they stay and mix? This reframing changes everything. Because language can spread without mass migration. Culture can shift without population collapse. Power does not always equal numbers. And ancestry does not reset just because a new name appears in the historical record. The debate Bulgarians inherited was built on sharp categories. One group replaces another. One origin defines identity. DNA suggests a different logic. Layering instead of erasure. Continuity instead of disappearance. And once we understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If history alone cannot explain why Bulgarians look, sound, and cluster the way they do today, then what can? The answer begins not with medieval migrations, but much deeper in time. If you travel across Bulgaria, one thing becomes obvious very quickly. People do not all look the same. In the north and west, lighter features are often more common. Fair skin, lighter hair, lighter eyes appear more frequently. In the south and parts of the east, darker hair and eyes are more visible. Skin tones shift from very fair to olive. Facial features vary as well. Sharper, more angular traits in some mountain regions. Softer, rounder traits in river valleys and plains. This visible diversity has fueled speculation for generations. Some interpret lighter features as evidence of Slavic ancestry. Darker traits are often explained as later mixing, sometimes blamed on southern neighbors or Ottoman influence. These assumptions feel intuitive. They seem to match simplified historical narratives. But intuition can be misleading. Here's the crucial pause. Physical appearance is not a direct map of ancestry. Traits like hair color, eye color, and facial structure are influenced by many genes, not one. They are shaped by complex inheritance, local adaptation, genetic drift, and historical mixing. They do not move in neat packages tied to a single migration or ethnic label. Two people can look very different and share similar ancestry. Two people can look similar and have very different genetic histories. This matters because many physical traits seen in modern Bulgarians existed in the region long before medieval migrations of any kind. Anthropological evidence suggests that variation between lighter and darker features already existed among ancient Balkan populations. Bronze Age communities in this region were not visually uniform. They never were. But here's what most people miss. Geography amplifies variation. Bulgaria sits at a crossroads of landscapes, mountains, plains, river systems, and coastlines all within a relatively small space. These environments shape how communities form and interact. Mountain villages tend to be more isolated. River valleys encourage movement and mixing. Coastal areas connect to trade networks. Over thousands of years, these patterns create visible regional differences without requiring large population replacement. Now comes the twist. What looks like evidence of separate origins often reflects layers of history instead. Different waves of influence settling unevenly across the landscape. Older populations blending with newcomers at different rates. Some regions absorbing change faster. Others holding on to older genetic patterns longer. This is why appearance alone cannot tell the full story. It hints at history, but it does not define it. DNA research reinforces this point. When geneticists examine Bulgarians from different regions, they do not see sharp internal divides that match simple North versus South stereotypes. Instead, they see shared foundations with gradual variation, a spectrum shaped by geography, not a patchwork of unrelated peoples. This tells us something important. The diversity we see today is not proof of fragmentation. It is evidence of continuity under pressure, of long-term settlement absorbing change instead of being erased by it. So when we ask why Bulgarians look so diverse, the answer is not one migration or one empire. It is time. Thousands of years of people living, adapting, mixing, and staying. And that leads us to the deeper question. If modern variation reflects long-term continuity rather than sudden replacement, then who were the people who formed the foundation in the first place? To find that answer, we have to go far beyond medieval history. We have to go back to the deep Balkan past. To understand Bulgarian DNA, we have to go much further back than names like Slav or Bulgar. We have to start before written history itself. The Balkans were not a peripheral zone waiting to be settled. They were one of the earliest and most consistently inhabited regions in Europe. Farming arrived here very early. Villages formed along rivers, on fertile plains, and in sheltered valleys. Over time, people adapted to mountains, forests, coastlines, and open grasslands. This was not a land of constant abandonment. It was a land of long-term residence. This matters more than it sounds, because in population genetics, continuity leaves a signature, and the deeper the continuity, the stronger that signature becomes. For a long time, historians assumed that waves of migration repeatedly wiped out earlier Balkan populations. New groups arrive, old ones vanish. The slate is wiped clean, but ancient DNA has forced researchers to rethink that model. When scientists analyze genetic material from prehistoric and early historic remains across the Balkans, they often see something surprising. Not disappearance, but persistence. Here's the key insight. Many of the people who lived in this region thousands of years ago did not leave when new cultures appeared. They stayed, they adapted, and when newcomers arrived, they mixed. This is what geneticists call continuity. DNA tells a quieter story. Instead of sharp breaks that match invasions or political change, it shows gradual transitions. Older genetic components remain present, even as new ones are added. Over time, this creates a layered population rather than a replaced one. In the case of Bulgaria, this deep layer is especially strong. Prehistoric Balkan populations were already diverse, shaped by early farming migrations, local hunter-gatherers, and later Bronze Age networks connecting the region to both Europe and Anatolia. By the time written history begins, the land that would become Bulgaria was already home to communities with deep roots and complex ancestry. But here's what most people miss. Continuity does not mean isolation. These early Balkan populations were not frozen in time. They traded. They intermarried. They absorbed influences from surrounding regions. What remained stable was not culture or language, but people themselves. Families stayed connected to land. Villages persisted across generations. Even when political control shifted, rural life often continued with remarkable stability. This is why ancient DNA from different periods in the Balkans often looks more similar than expected. The people beneath the empires remained. Now comes the twist. When modern Bulgarians are compared genetically to ancient samples from the region, researchers often find measurable connections. Not identical profiles, but shared components that point to long-term ancestry in the same landscape. This does not mean modern Bulgarians are unchanged replicas of prehistoric people. It means that the foundation was never erased. Think of it like bedrock. Every migration, every empire, every cultural shift added new layers. But those layers settled on something solid. The base remained. This challenges an older way of thinking about European history. Especially in regions like the Balkans, history is often told as a sequence of invasions. But invasions do not automatically equal population replacement. Most conquerors rule existing populations. Most migrants settle among locals rather than replacing them completely. And the Balkans, with their mountains and valleys, encouraged exactly this pattern. Large-scale population turnover is difficult in such terrain. Movement happens, but replacement is rare. Geography slows change. It protects continuity. This helps explain why Bulgarian DNA today clusters closely with other Balkan populations, rather than with distant regions associated with specific historical groups. The shared foundation matters more than later labels. And this foundation sets the stage for everything that follows. Because once we recognize that a deep Balkan population persisted through prehistory and into recorded history, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who were the people living on this foundation when history finally began to name them? The answer brings us to one of the most misunderstood groups in European history, the Thracians. When history finally begins to name the people of this land, one name appears again and again: the Thracians. For centuries, Thracian tribes occupied much of what is now Bulgaria. But calling them a single people can be misleading. They were not one unified nation. They were many groups, spread across plains, river valleys, forests, and mountains. Some lived from farming. Others controlled trade routes. Some were known as warriors. Others as metal workers, traders, or ritual specialists. Geography shaped them, and diversity defined them. Ancient Greek and Roman writers mentioned the Thracians constantly, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with fear. But one thing is clear: this region was deeply Thracian long before Rome, long before Slavs, long before the Bulgarian state. Yet if you open many history books, you encounter a familiar claim: the Thracians disappeared. According to this narrative, Roman conquest weakened them. Later, Slavic migrations absorbed or erased them. Over time, the Thracians supposedly vanished, leaving behind only place names, artifacts, and legends. But here's what most people miss. Disappearance in historical records does not equal biological disappearance. When a group stops being named, it does not mean the people themselves are gone. It often means their identity changed, their language shifted, their political structures collapsed. But families remained, villages remained, life went on. DNA research forces us to confront this distinction. When scientists compare ancient DNA from Thracian-era remains with modern populations in Bulgaria, they often find continuity, not perfect matches, not frozen identities, but shared genetic components that suggest absorption rather than replacement. The Thracians did not vanish, they blended. Now comes the twist. The very process that erased the Thracian name may have helped preserve their ancestry. As Roman rule expanded, cities changed quickly. Latin spread. Administration shifted. But most people did not live in cities. They lived in rural communities. They farmed the same land their ancestors had farmed for generations. Roman rule reorganized power from above, but it rarely emptied the countryside. Later, when Slavic-speaking groups entered the Balkans, they encountered these same communities, established villages, long-settled populations. Over generations, intermarriage followed, language shifted, customs evolved, but the people themselves remained part of the population. This is how absorption works. No single dramatic moment, no mass disappearance, just slow blending over centuries. Imagine families living in the same valleys, on the same hillsides, across generations. Children growing up bilingual, marriages linking newcomers and locals, names changing, traditions merging. Over time, the label Thracian fades, but the ancestry does not. DNA tells a quieter story. Instead of a collapse, it shows continuity through transition. Thracian ancestry does not dominate modern Bulgarian DNA in isolation, but it forms a significant part of the deeper Balkan layer that persists across time. It is measurable, it is real, and it challenges the idea that ancient peoples simply vanish when history moves on. This does not mean modern Bulgarians are Thracians in any cultural sense. Culture changes fast, genes change slowly. Identity is not inherited in the same way DNA is. The Thracians as a named people are gone, their language is gone, their political world collapsed long ago, but their descendants did not disappear. And this matters, because it reframes how we think about the Balkans. It suggests that ancient populations were not wiped out by every new wave of history. They were absorbed into it. The land did not empty and refill. It accumulated. This also explains why extreme claims on either side fail. Bulgarians are not unchanged Thracians, but they are not disconnected from them either. The Thracians are part of the foundation, one layer among several, embedded deeply in the population. And this realization sets up one of the most important shifts in the entire story. Because if Thracian ancestry persisted beneath changing identities, then what happened when a completely new language reshaped the region? A language that still defines Bulgaria today. To answer that, we have to move into the early medieval period, to the arrival of Slavic-speaking communities, and to one of the most misunderstood processes in human history: language shift. Few chapters in Bulgarian history feel as decisive as the arrival of the Slavs. It is here that language, names, and identity seem to change almost completely. By the early medieval period, Slavic-speaking groups began moving into the Balkans in significant numbers. They arrived gradually, not as a single wave, but as many communities over time. They brought new social structures, new customs, and most importantly, a language that would eventually become dominant across much of the region. This fact alone has shaped how many people understand Bulgarian origins. Bulgarians speak a Slavic language today. Therefore, the logic goes, Bulgarians must be primarily Slavic in ancestry. It feels straightforward. Language becomes ancestry. Culture becomes bloodline. But here's what most people miss. Language does not move the same way genes do. Throughout history, languages have spread faster than populations. They spread through power, trade, religion, and social advantage. A language can become dominant without eliminating the people who spoke something else before. This process is known as language shift, and it is far more common than population replacement. DNA tells a quieter story. When geneticists look at modern Bulgarians, they do not see evidence of a complete demographic reset during the Slavic migrations. Instead, they see mixing. Slavic ancestry is clearly present and significant, but it sits on top of older Balkan layers rather than replacing them. Now comes the twist. The success of Slavic language may actually be evidence of integration, not dominance by numbers. Slavic communities often settled among existing populations rather than displacing them. Over generations, local people adopted Slavic speech because it made sense. It connected them to new networks. It aligned them with emerging power structures. It became the language of everyday life, village organization, and eventually religion and administration. Children growing up in mixed communities learned Slavic as their first language. Their grandparents may not have, but genetically, they were still descendants of older Balkan populations. This is how identity can change without ancestry disappearing. History moved fast. People stayed. This pattern explains something important about Bulgaria. Slavic language reshaped identity from the outside inward. Names, customs, and political organization shifted. But beneath that cultural transformation, much of the population remained continuous with earlier inhabitants, including those with Thracian and prehistoric Balkan roots. And DNA supports this. Modern Bulgarians cluster genetically with other Balkan populations, not primarily with populations from regions farther north, often associated with early Slavic homelands. This does not deny Slavic influence. It contextualizes it. Slavic ancestry is real. It is part of the mix. But it is not the whole story. Another common misunderstanding is the idea of replacement, that Slavs arrived to an empty or devastated land. Archaeology and genetics both challenge this. The Balkans were inhabited, villages existed, fields were farmed. Slavic newcomers entered a living landscape, not a vacuum. Over time, boundaries blurred. Intermarriage followed. Communities merged. The Slavic layer grew stronger culturally, even as genetic continuity remained strong biologically. This is why modern Bulgarians can speak a Slavic language while carrying much older Balkan ancestry. Culture can change fast. Genes change slowly. This distinction is essential, because without it, we risk confusing identity with origin and language with lineage. Bulgarian identity today is deeply shaped by Slavic heritage, but Bulgarian DNA reflects a longer, more complex history. And just when this new Slavic-speaking world was taking shape, another group entered the story. Smaller in number, outsized in impact, often misunderstood. A group whose name would define the state itself. The Bulgars. Few groups in European history are as misunderstood as the Bulgars. Their name survived. Their state endured. But their actual numbers are often exaggerated. The Bulgars originated in the Eurasian steppe world far to the east. This was a landscape shaped by mobility, horses, and military organization. Steppe societies were not defined by large populations. They were defined by structure, discipline, and leadership. When the Bulgars moved west and entered the Balkans, they did not arrive as a massive migrating population. They arrived as an elite. This distinction matters, because power does not equal numbers. The Bulgars formed the political core of the early Bulgarian state. They organized armies. They negotiated with empires. They imposed structures of rule. And most importantly, they gave the country its name. This alone has led many people to assume their genetic impact must have been equally dominant. But DNA suggests something more nuanced. When modern genetic studies look for steppe or inner Eurasian ancestry in Bulgaria, they often find it. But usually at relatively modest levels. It is detectable. It is real. But it does not dominate the genetic profile. This aligns closely with what we would expect from an elite group integrating into a much larger local population. Now comes the twist. The Bulgars may have shaped identity more through politics than through reproduction. They ruled over communities that were already largely Slavic-speaking and deeply rooted in older Balkan ancestry. Over time, intermarriage occurred. Bulgar elites merged into local society. Their original language disappeared. Their cultural practices blended. What survived most strongly was their name and their political legacy. This pattern is not unique to Bulgaria. History offers many examples where small ruling groups left enormous cultural or political marks without replacing the population beneath them. Names persist. Titles persist. But genes blend quietly into the background. This helps explain another persistent myth. The idea that Bulgars were dramatically different in appearance, often imagined as clearly Central Asian or Turkic-looking, is exaggerated. Steppe populations themselves were diverse, and after generations of mixing in the Balkans, any distinct physical profile would have softened quickly. Appearance is a poor guide here. Ancestry cannot be read from faces alone. DNA tells a quieter story. It shows traces, not dominance, influence, not replacement. The Bulgar contribution matters. It is part of the layered story, but it does not erase the deep Balkan foundation. It does not override Slavic ancestry. Instead, it sits alongside them, woven into the population over time. And this reveals something crucial about how nations form. Political identity can emerge rapidly. A state can be named. Borders can be drawn. But the people inside those borders are rarely new. They are almost always inherited. By the time the Bulgarian state solidified, its population was already complex. Deep Balkan roots, Thracian absorption, Slavic language and culture, and now a Bulgar political layer added on top. But history did not stop there. Empires continued to pass through this land, Rome before, Byzantium after, and each left visible marks on culture, religion, and daily life. The question is, did they change the people themselves? To answer that, we have to confront another powerful assumption, that empire equals demographic transformation. DNA suggests otherwise. When people think of empire, they imagine transformation, new cities, new laws, new languages, new people. And in the Balkans, Roman and later Byzantine rule certainly changed the landscape. Roads connected distant regions, cities expanded, trade intensified. Soldiers moved across provinces, administration reached into daily life. From the outside, it looks like a complete reset. But here's what most people miss. Empire does not automatically mean population replacement. Roman rule in the Balkans was powerful, but it was also practical. Rome governed vast territories, and it did so by ruling people where they already lived. Colonists and soldiers arrived, yes. Urban centers grew. But the majority of the population did not move. Rural communities remained tied to their land, working the same fields their families had cultivated for generations. DNA tells a quieter story. When geneticists look for sharp changes that would match Roman conquest, they usually do not find them. Instead of sudden breaks, they see continuity. Older Balkan ancestry persists across the Roman period. Cultural layers accumulate, but the biological foundation stays largely intact. Now comes the twist. The more visible the empire, the less visible its genetic impact tends to be. Cities change fast. Elites rotate. Languages of administration shift. But most people live outside cities, in villages, in valleys, in agricultural landscapes where continuity is the rule. Romanization often meant adopting new customs, new names, and new identities without leaving home. Byzantine rule followed a similar pattern. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, state maintained control over much of the Balkans for centuries. Christianity spread. Greek became important in administration and religion. Political authority shifted again. Yet once more, the genetic picture remained remarkably stable. People adapted without disappearing. This challenges a common assumption, that each empire brought a new population that replaced the old one. In reality, most empires govern existing people. They reshape culture far more than they reshape ancestry. This is why modern Bulgarian DNA does not show dramatic Roman or Byzantine replacement signals. The influence of these empires is undeniable, but it is written mostly in stone, language, religion, and institutions, not in mass demographic turnover. History moved, people stayed. This distinction helps explain why political timelines and genetic timelines rarely align. Empires rise and fall quickly. Genes move slowly. They follow families, not borders. And this brings us to one of the most emotionally charged chapters in Bulgarian history, a period often blamed for changing everything, the Ottoman era. Many people assume centuries of Ottoman rule must have transformed the population completely, that the genetic impact must match the cultural shift. But does it? To find out, we have to separate fear from evidence, and myth from measurable data. Because once again, DNA tells a story very different from popular imagination. Few periods in Bulgarian history carry as much emotional weight as the Ottoman era. Centuries of imperial rule left deep marks on culture, religion, and collective memory. Because of this, many people assume the demographic impact must have been just as profound. The common belief is simple: long Ottoman rule equals large-scale population change. But here's what most people miss. Cultural transformation does not automatically mean genetic replacement. The Ottoman Empire governed a vast and diverse territory. Its strength lay not in replacing populations, but in managing them. Most people remained where they were. They farmed the same land. They lived in the same villages. They passed down ancestry quietly, even as laws, taxes, and religious institutions shifted above them. DNA tells a quieter story. When genetic studies examine modern Bulgarians, they do not strongly support the idea of a full population reset during the Ottoman period. There is evidence of some gene flow, as we would expect in any long-lasting empire. Soldiers, administrators, merchants, and converts moved through the region. Intermarriage happened, but the scale appears limited. Now comes the twist. The Ottoman impact was massive culturally, but modest genetically. Religion changed for some communities. Social structures shifted. New identities formed. But these changes often occurred within existing populations rather than through replacement by newcomers. Many families who adopted new customs or faiths were still descendants of people who had lived on this land for centuries. This is a pattern seen across the empire. Ottoman administration relied heavily on local populations. It did not require mass settlement from Anatolia to function. In rural areas especially, continuity remained strong. Villages persisted. Family lines continued. Geography once again played a role. Mountains and valleys limited large-scale demographic upheaval. This does not mean the Ottoman period left no genetic trace. It means those traces are layered, not dominant. They sit alongside older Balkan, Thracian, Slavic, and Bulgar components rather than replacing them. And this matters, because it challenges a deeply ingrained narrative. The idea that identity must follow power, that centuries of rule must erase what came before. DNA suggests otherwise. It suggests endurance. History moved. People stayed. By the end of the Ottoman period, the population of what is now Bulgaria was already the result of many layers: a deep Balkan foundation, Thracian absorption, Slavic language and culture, Bulgar political legacy, Roman and Byzantine cultural layers, Ottoman-era influences added on top. No single chapter erased the others. And this brings us to the most important question of all. When scientists step back and look at modern Bulgarian DNA as a whole, what do they actually see? Not theories, not national myths, but patterns measured across thousands of genetic markers. The answer brings every layer together, and it reveals why Bulgaria is one of the clearest examples in Europe of how populations survive history rather than being replaced by it. So when scientists step back and look at modern Bulgarian DNA as a whole, what do they actually see? Not a single origin story, not a clean break, not a population created in one moment. They see layers. This is the key shift that modern genetics brings to the discussion. Instead of asking which group replaced which, researchers model ancestry as accumulation. Older layers persist while new ones are added. Over time, the population becomes a record of survival, not erasure. The first and deepest layer is the prehistoric Balkan foundation. This goes back thousands of years, to early farmers and earlier inhabitants who settled this land long before recorded history. Ancient DNA often shows strong continuity from these populations into later periods. This is the bedrock. It anchors the entire genetic profile. On top of that sits the Thracian layer. Not as a separate block, but as part of the same deep Balkan continuity. The Thracians were absorbed, not erased. Their genetic signature blends into the population rather than standing apart. The name disappeared. The ancestry remained. Then comes the Slavic layer. This one is significant. It reflects early medieval migrations and long-term integration. Slavic ancestry reshaped language, culture, and identity. But genetically, it merged with existing populations rather than replacing them. This is why Bulgarians speak a Slavic language while still clustering genetically with their Balkan neighbors. Next is the Bulgar layer from the steppe, smaller but detectable. It reflects an elite group whose political impact far exceeded its demographic size. Their genetic contribution exists, but it does not dominate. Power left a louder mark than DNA. Finally, there are later influences: Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman. These layers are more cultural than biological. Genetic studies often do not support scenarios of mass replacement during these periods. Instead, they show continuity with modest gene flow, exactly what we would expect from long-lasting empires ruling existing populations. Now comes the myth-busting moment. First myth: Bulgarians are purely Slavic. This fails because it ignores deep Balkan continuity. Second myth: Thracians disappeared completely. This fails because DNA points to absorption, not extinction. Third myth: Bulgars or Ottomans replaced everyone. This fails because genetic data does not show a population reset. DNA tells a quieter story. Modern Bulgarians cluster closely with other Balkan populations, not because borders never changed, but because people often stayed. The region shows long-term stability with gradual mixing. This is why extreme claims collapse under genetic evidence. Bulgaria is not a story of purity. It is a story of persistence. And that brings us to the final question. Why does this matter? This story matters because it changes how we think about identity. Identity is not born in a single migration. It is not fixed by one empire. It is not written once and never revised. Identity forms slowly, through survival, adaptation, and coexistence. Culture can change fast, genes change slowly, and history often moves faster than people do. Bulgaria is not unique in this, but it is one of the clearest examples. A region where continuity endured despite constant pressure, where names changed, languages shifted, empires rose and fell, but the population itself was rarely erased. Empires passed through the land, but the people often stayed. This perspective does not diminish history. It deepens it. It allows us to see beyond myths built for simplicity or politics. It replaces arguments about purity with evidence of resilience. It reminds us that human populations are not static objects. They are living systems. And this insight reaches far beyond Bulgaria. The Balkan story helps us understand Europe itself, a continent shaped less by replacement than by layering, less by clean beginnings than by long continuity. Borders moved, labels changed, but people remained connected across time. So here are 3 questions to take with you tonight. If language can change without ancestry disappearing, how many other identities are older than we think? If continuity survived so many empires, what does that say about the resilience of ordinary people? And if DNA reveals connection instead of division, how should that reshape the way we see ourselves today? History moved. People stayed. Good night.